Hello everyone, this is Joseph Berg, and today we'll be discussing the incident investigation of T2 Laboratories Incorporated runaway chemical explosion. The incident took place in Jacksonville, Florida. It occurred on December 19, 2007, and it was a reactive incident. The investigation status is that the CSB finally report was approved by the board at a public meeting in Jacksonville, Florida on September 15, 2009. An overview of the accident. On the day of the explosion, 4 people were killed and 13 others were transported to the hospital. T2 Laboratories Incorporated encountered a cooling problem during the production of gasoline additive called MCMT. When the temperature of the exothermic chemical reaction reaches a certain degree, the heating element is turned off. After that, regular city water flows to a cooling system that surrounds the reactor vessel to control the temperature of the reaction. On the day of the incident, the operator started to cool the reaction as usual, but no water was flowing through the pipe caused from either a blockage or valve failure. T2 Laboratories did not have a secondary nor an emergency cooling system in place to cool the reactor. Since the reactor was not cooled properly, the chemical reaction temperature began to increase, becoming a runaway chemical reaction that they have no control over. Employees were not aware of the severity of the hazardous chemicals, nor were they trained or educated to handle this problem. Eventually, the reactor vessel temperature and pressure increased until the vessel exploded, causing a catastrophic incident. It was later found that the facility had experienced cooling problems before the incident ever took place. What happened at T2 Laboratories could have been avoided if the company would have practiced only 4 of the 14 major elements listed under 29 CFR 1910.119. An overview from the explosion is taken from afar. It's taken in real time, so it just goes to show you how long the explosion actually lasted. That is incredible. It's been roughly around 25, 30 seconds, and it's still lasting incredibly long. The 14 major elements of OSHA's process safety management system actually consist of 16 elements, but the first one is application and the second one is the definition. So the major elements actually only consist of 14, and they start at Title 29 CFR 1910.119 C, and then it goes on from there to show you the rest. The first one consists of employee participation. The second element is process safety information. The third is process hazard analysis, operating procedures, training, contractors, pre-startup review, mechanical integrity, hot work permit, management of change, incident investigation, emergency planning and response, compliance audits, and trade secrets. The labels outlined in yellow and red are the elements that apply to the T2 Laboratories incident. So T2 Laboratories should have followed the operating procedures, pre-startup review, mechanical integrity, and the management of change. T2 Labs operating procedures issues or violations that I could determine from the incident is listed under Title 29 CFR 1910.119 F1ID is the emergency shutdown, including the conditions under which emergency shutdown is required and the assignment of shutdown responsibility to qualified operators to ensure that emergency shutdown is executed in a safe and timely manner. The other operating procedures consist of emergency operations, consequences of deviations, the steps required to correct or avoid deviation, which is determined that there was no other secondary or emergency way to cool the reactor, which is very dangerous. Continued. The operating procedures issues, also the precautions necessary to prevent exposure, including engineering controls, administrative controls, and personal protective equipment. Quality control for raw materials and control of hazardous chemical inventory levels. This would be loss of control and no quality of control for the raw materials in the reactor. There was only one way to control the temperature, which is not safe. The employer shall develop and implement work safety practices to provide for the control of hazards during operations such as a lockout, tagout, confined space entry, and opening process equipment of piping. The opening process equipment of piping is key because it was the opening or the valve failure or blockage that prevented the reactor from being cooled by no water being able to flow through the pipe. Operating procedures versus T2 Laboratories Incorporated. This is how the operating procedures apply. T2 did not have an emergency cooling procedure for cooling the reactor and only relied on one way of cooling the reactor. When the T2 operator noticed the deviation, the reactor overheating in this case, he did not understand the severity of the situation nor the proper safety procedures to deal with such an occasion. T2 did not have preventative measures in place to avoid this situation, such as a secondary or emergency means of controlling the temperature of the reactor. Emergency would be it's overheating, we have an emergency shutdown. There was nothing in place to have an emergency shutdown, nor did they understand that they should be having an emergency shutdown because of the reactor. T2's cooling water pipe, in this case, malfunctioned from either a blockage or valve failure, and the cooling system was knowingly not working right. The second process safety management system element that T2 Labs violated is a pre-startup safety review issue. In this case, it is safety operating, maintenance, and emergency procedures are in place and are adequate. They did not have emergency procedures in place, and the operating equipment was not working adequately. T2 Laboratories did not have an emergency cooling procedure in place that was adequate to cool the reactor in case of an overheating reaction. This is easily foreseeable, and I do not understand why they did not have an emergency procedure in place for a runaway chemical reaction. That is the basis of their job, is creating this reaction. They should always have something to avoid a runaway chemical reaction. The mechanical integrity revolves around the actual piping, the pressure vessel and the storage tanks, the piping system, relief and vent systems and devices. In this case, that would be the water. Emergency shutdown systems. Another key point is the training for process maintenance activities. The employer shall train each employee involved in maintaining the ongoing integrity of the process equipment in an overview of that process and its hazards and in the procedures applicable to the employee's job task to assure that the employee can perform the job task in a safe manner. This means that the employer should train the employee in all the possible outcomes to make sure that the integrity of the process and the equipment continues to go, and how to handle hazards safely and the correct procedures to perform under certain situations during the job task. This was not done by T2 Laboratories. The employees were clueless as to the severity of what was actually taking place. The reactor, water piping system, relief system, and the emergency shutdown system at T2 was not performed, prepared, or inspected accordingly. None of the operators at the facility were trained in maintaining the ongoing integrity of the process equipment and an overview of that process and its hazards. That means they had no clue of the hazards involved in the process they were doing. And if had they known the severity of it, some or majority of the people could have got to safety. The fourth process safety management major element that T2 Laboratories violated is the management of change. First, the employer shall establish and implement written procedures to management changes to process chemicals, technology, equipment procedures, and changes to the facilities that affect a covered process. In this case, the overheat and like the absence of the cooling process would be the change in the process. So once they knew they had no way to cool the actual reactor, then the next procedure in place should have been everyone run as far away as they can or run to shelter or some type of safety. And that the impact of the change on safety and health was not known. Had they known that the impact could have been this catastrophic, everyone would have been a lot more self-aware, alarmed, and proceeded with the correct procedures that should have been in place hastily. Thirdly, employees involved in operating a process and maintenance and contract employees whose job tasks will be affected by a change in the process shall be informed of and trained in the change prior to startup of the process or affected part of the process. The affected part of the process is the overheating of the reactor. The employees, every employee working at T2 Labs should have been trained in the possibility of a overheated or lost control runaway chemical reaction. Every employee should be trained on how to identify what to do, and they should practice drills on how to stop a runaway chemical reaction. This should have been in place already. And that the employees should have been notified about the change. They were notified about the change, but they were not knowledgeable or trained in the aspects to deal with a runaway chemical reaction. The impact on safety and health became lethal once T2's reactor had nothing to control the temperature. This possible situation should have been foreseen and have control measures in place to cool the reactor by other means. T2 employees were not trained or informed on how to proceed with change in the situation, which is the uncontrollable reaction. A summary of this is that T2 Laboratories experienced a defective operating procedures, pre-startup review, mechanical integrity, and management of change in this tragedy. After assessing the incident, the best preventative measure would have been to have a secondary or emergency form of controlling the temperature of the reactor in the case that the primary cooling source were to be compromised. There was only one way to control the temperature of the reactor, which is not acceptable, especially when it is the only preventative measure to avoid an explosion. Management should have foreseen this problem and developed an emergency means of cooling the tank. Not only should management have developed an emergency procedures, but they should have also trained and informed employees about the possible hazards along with executing emergency drills for a possible runaway chemical reaction. Thank you everyone. I appreciate you watching and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.